Every summer the camp had a ritual. On the fourth afternoon, after the first blisters had hardened into badges and the first homesick letters had been mailed, the whole cabin took the long trail to Swan Lake. Counselors loved the hike because it was safe in the way this part of Maine defines safety. Well-worn, mostly flat, bordered by blueberry scrub and boulders warmed by sun. The lake itself was a clean coin dropped in a bowl of hills, cold even in July, where the campers dared each other to jump from a smooth glacial rock the locals called the piano. The water rang like metal when you hit it. Somebody always screamed from surprise. Somebody always pretended not to be afraid. On July 18th, 2001, Cabin 3 set out after lunch. The boys were 16, of the half-wild, half-tender kind you find everywhere in summer. Lanky, loud when a counselor listened, silent when a bird crossed the path, flicking bottle caps at each other and pretending they didn't care how this season would remember them. Bringing up the rear was a kid named Evan Mercer. He walked with his head tilted the way people do when they're listening for something only they can hear. Evan was the quiet one. That is not an insult. His mother used to say he was the room in a house with the door always slightly ajar, private, but inviting if you had the patience to knock properly. He was 16 that summer, a year older than his grade because he'd been sick in second or because time had chosen to collect him differently. The stories varied, and he didn't correct people. He drew maps. Not just, or even mostly, maps, the kind with roads and labels, but hand-drawn drafts of places he loved as if he could keep them safe by getting their shapes right. His social studies teacher wrote on his report card that he had a cartographer's heart. Evan had glued that phrase inside his notebook and let it push him forward the way flattery sometimes does when it arrives without irony. The camp, Birchfield, sat in the north woods a few miles off Route 15, a handful of cabins, and a mess hall colored to blend in with the pines. The director liked to tell parents at drop-off that there was no better place to get lost and found, a sentence that sounded different later. Birchfield promised canoeing and night skies and counselors with guitars who knew 3 chords and every verse that mattered. Evan hadn't asked to go. His mother had nudged, said it would be good to be outside someplace where the map wasn't a page but the ground under your feet. He'd shrugged and said okay. He wore the same green sweatshirt 3 days in a row because it made him feel like part of the scenery. On the day of the hike, the counselors counted off and made their speech about staying together, about the moments on a trail when someone can drift without noticing. If you stop to tie your shoe, tell someone, said Amy, the head counselor for Cabin 3, good-natured, strong in that way that always made adults say, "She'll make a great teacher." She made a joke about the mosquitoes requiring permission slips, and the boys groaned the way 16-year-olds do when they like a person and want it known indirectly. Then they walked. Evan carried a small spiral-bound notebook with a cardboard cover rough under his thumb. He didn't draw while he walked. He wasn't a fool, but he stopped now and again to put an X on a stone, a dot where a brook crossed, a tiny sketch of a crooked cedar that looked like an old woman's hand. He liked how a place became more obedient when you rehearsed it that way. He liked, too, that the trail markers, small blue blazes painted on trunks, made a sequence he could predict. It meant a mind like his could rest without feeling lazy. The procession stretched and bunched the way processions do. 2 boys ran ahead, trying to jog the whole distance. One limped, hemming up a blister. Amy kept a pace that let her count heads without making the counting obvious. Near the halfway point, the path ran through a patch of bog bridging into spruce. The sun failed there, not absent, just filtered into a kind of underpaint. It was cooler. The air had the sweet rot of wet places and the old penny smell of iron. At a switchback where the trail cut around a glacial erratic big enough to host a picnic, Evan paused. He wasn't winded. He wanted to draw the boulder's lichen, pale mint circles overlapping like the start of a constellation. He put his notebook against the rock, shaded a smudge with the side of the pencil lead, and listened to his cabin mates clatter up the next rise. He could still hear them when he finished. It would be easy to catch up. He took the kind of breath you take when you know things are going right, and stepped back onto the path. The sound of the boys ahead folded into leaves. Evan walked faster. Sharp left at the cedar snag, right where the root tangle made steps, straight past the little seep where frogs liked to be unhelpfully loud. He reached the ridge knuckle and looked down. The trail ahead forked in a way it did not on the official map. It was not a dramatic divergence. One path kept the blue blazes and the sense of being the main thought. The other, narrow, braided, seemed a shortcut along the slope. Somebody had made it with their feet. That is how most shortcuts are made. Evan hesitated because that is what intelligent kids do when the ground asks them to. He listened. He thought he heard a counselor's voice and laughter from the shortcut, and it is also what intelligent kids do to trust human signs over painted ones. He went right. In the next 100 yards, the forest changed. Hemlocks drew closer, shouldering out light. The shortcut revealed itself as a moose line pretending to be a trail. Wind, which had been a rumor all day, found a voice high in the canopy and began to speak nonsense. After 50 more feet, someone, whether moose or boy, had veered around a wind throw, and the line dissolved into leaf litter and good intentions. Evan stopped. It is not always dramatic when it happens. There is no switch you feel thrown. One minute you are a person on a trail near a lake, and the next you are a person in woods with no trail, not near anything you can name. Fear is not even the first feeling. Irritation is. Then quick calculation. Then the next reasonable step, backtrack. He turned. The slope was the same in all directions. A boulder that looked like a dog from one angle looked like a horse from another. He took 3 paces and found a deadfall he didn't remember. He looked up to orient by the light and found green. When he looked down again, the ground had perfected the art of disguise. He did not panic. He was, after all, a cartographer in a world that begged to be mapped. He took out the notebook and wrote, in small calm letters, "Lost, minor," because you can convince the future of a fact if you write it plainly enough. He sketched the impressions he had of where the shortcut had seemed to go, drew a little north arrow because it comforted him though he had no compass, and decided to aim diagonally downhill because trails like lakes and level ground. He made 2 careful blazes, small scrapes with his pocket knife on hemlock bark, to mark his own path in reverse, and moved. Up the trail the boys shouted at a dragonfly landing on the counselor's cap. Amy counted heads and came up one short. She stopped, called Evan's name in the cheerful, non-threatening voice of adults who want to be obeyed without admitting they are being serious. The boys rolled their eyes because attention is currency at that age, and they were allergic to sharing it. She tried again. She jogged back down the trail with the other counselor, Mateo, and found the boulder with the lichen and the sketch of the lichen and nothing else. He was just here, Mateo said, though of course he had no idea what interval just measured. They followed the blue blazes backwards, then forwards. They sent 2 boys up to the next switchback with instructions to stay where she could see their shirts. The path looked correct in both directions. By the time they reached the lake, they were 1 down and knew it. And in the code of every decent youth program, the lake outing became a swift call on a radio in a tight voice and a head count repeated until it sounded like a chant. Camp protocol worked the way plans do when people have bothered to make them soberly in winter. The director notified the county. The county called the warden service. A search and rescue team began to drive. Back at Birchfield, counselors fanned out along the main trail, calling, hands cupped. The boys, wired by a mix of excitement and dread, offered to split up and were told no with gratitude, so firm it sounded holy. Evan walked. His pacing was not frantic, it was attentive. He made a 3rd blaze and a 4th. He realized the slope was tricking him. He was spiraling. He corrected. He heard something and stopped. Water, maybe, or wind making a lie of water. Then, faintly, a voice. It could have been a counselor's name he wasn't sure he liked for fear of wanting it too much. He called back. The voice didn't repeat. He swallowed the kind of worry that dries the mouth. At 5 the wind freshened. At 5:30 a grayness assembled between the trees the way fog does when it decides it prefers altitude. At 6, thunder talked to itself over the ridge. Anyone who has ever been 16 knows how easily you can believe a summer storm is about you. The first dogs arrived at 8, riders in the backs of trucks, handlers with harnesses, and a hurricane of leashes. Birchfield's director had saved an old t-shirt from the lost and found and never washed it. Amy found a sock of Evan's and handed it over. The dogs took the scent the way fires take paper, heads swinging, tails painting commas in air. They ran the main trail clean. Evan's path to the lichen boulder was a bright line to them, then turned at the fork and hesitated. The place they lost it had a name among some of the staff. Cathedral Grove. Hemlock trunks older than local memory. A carpet of needles that drank sound. Air so cool it felt like a different season without permission. The handlers marked it on their maps. Scent pool, one said, writing with a carpenter's pencil. Then nothing. The older of the 2 dogs whined softly and lay down. Rain saw them and decided to be helpful in its usual way, the kind that erases. It fell in a sheet that reorganized every fine print clue the woods had left. The searchers threw tarps over radios and set up a command tent by the mess hall and drew lines with grease pencil on a clear map atop the paper one, so they could adjust without wearing holes. Headlamps made insect halos. Teen boys drank cocoa they didn't want and pretended not to hear how adults edited their voices around them. By midnight, the search was official. A logbook was opened. Names were written next to sectors. Volunteers were turned into nouns, flankers, line leaders, sweepers. A firefighter from town who had been to funerals he didn't speak about stood at the edge of the tent and looked into the dark the way a man looks into a room where he once turned out the lights on purpose. Amy found herself at the boulder again at 1 in the morning, hearing the subtle human wreckage of someone crying in trees. She called Evan's name until it felt like a borrowed word. Some searches have a single, cinematic clue. This one had only mid-shelf mysteries. A candy wrapper 100 yards off the main trail. What is a skin? The kind they served in the mess hall. A boot mark that could have matched the tread on Evan's new hiking shoes, or any other 16-year-old's, blurred by rain into archetype. A small knife nick on a hemlock 2 feet off the ground, exactly like the kind Evan might make, and which the forest had in abundance. The dogs drew loops and spirals in Cathedral Grove and then lay down again, as if the scent there had never migrated from that cool hollow of needles. Morning expanded the search like thaw. Parents arrived with faces that shut you up. Mark and Dana Mercer were ordinary people whose ordinariness became a kind of shining. Mark asked to see the map and kept himself from tracing routes with his finger because touching a representation of a place you can't control is a confession. Dana tried to sit still and then stood and then apologized for standing and then didn't. Amy told them everything and nothing. The director reminded himself not to clutch his coffee like a rosary. The second day gave back more of the same. The third, less. On the fourth day, a pilot in a Cessna flew low enough to comb the treetops and came back with news that would eventually feel like not news. "Canopy too dense," he said into the radio, as if he were telling them what they already knew about their own hearts. The ground teams pushed grids out from the grove, and then again after the next rain when both grids had to be reset. A warden found a place where a small animal had recently died and dug because, in the arithmetic of hope, animals sometimes keep clues. The camp's maintenance man walked every length of old stone wall on the property because New England remembers in lines, and sometimes lines catch boys. He found a painted turtle wedged under a rock and let it go in the creek. At a week, the state's paperwork began to nudge at the language. Missing persons case. Juvenile. Last seen 7/18, 1,500 hours. Sent lost in hemlock stand. Evidence of foul play? None. Suspected endangerment? Weather? Terrain. It is obscene to see a life compressed into boxes and check marks. It is also one of the ways a civilization admits it is trying. Mark Mercer signed the portion that permitted the use of helicopters on public land. Dana signed something that allowed searchers to look inside anything that could legally be defined as a structure. Later, she would not remember the shape of the form. She would remember the weight of the pen. By the time the official search scaled down, a phrase chosen with care to prevent the verb that ends in ed, the county had spent money that would be mentioned at a budget meeting and nodded over like an apology. The cabin boys were bussed home early with a speech about safety none of them listened to. Evan's bunkmate, a kid named Ryan who had learned to hide his kindness in the way of kids from homes that require it, left the camp without his flashlight and refused to admit why. At the Mercer house, an extra chair at the kitchen table became a quiet problem no one solved. The years that followed were ordinary and cruel. Posters faded and were replaced and faded again, which is the fate of anything left in sunlight long enough. The counselor Amy became a teacher, then an assistant principal, and kept a copy of the search map rolled in her closet the way some people keep a wedding dress. The director of Birchfield retired early and moved closer to town where cell reception was better, not that it mattered anymore. Evan's parents learned how to answer kind questions asked by people who wanted to be the person who asked them. They learned when to send a conversation quietly back into its lane. There were stories, as there always are. Someone in the next county swore they saw a boy at a truck stop who looked like Evan but older and with a scar. The boy turned out to be a runaway from Pennsylvania whose mother wept with relief in a way that carved the Mercers thinner without letting them break. A hunter said he'd found a boot 3 ridges over. It belonged to a hiker who'd lost it in '98 and was glad to have it back. A teenager claimed Evan had hitched out of camp and joined a commune. The commune turned out to be 2 vans and a dog. People bought psychic readings the way they buy insomniac snacks. Nothing tasted good after. Ryan, the bunkmate, grew into a man with a job that required spreadsheets and an apartment that required cleaning. On September 18th every year, he went for a long walk and didn't tell anyone why. Sometimes he looped through a park with a notebook and drew arrows on a map of a place he already knew by heart. He did not go back to Birchfield because adulthood had given him the gift of knowing which returns are not remedies. Time in Maine has winters and other seasons. 20 years turned like a snowplow turns, slow at the moment of the pivot, then sudden as it commits. The camp had closed and reopened and rebranded as something with adventure in the title. The hemlocks in Cathedral Grove held on to their green even as the woolly adelgid inched north and made new kinds of grief. The stone wall the maintenance man had walked through became a teaching tool for school groups, and a guide told children to lay their hands on it and feel the way a line can hold a history even when the people are gone. Then the storm came. It was not history-making by the standards of a place that keeps good records, but it had shoulders. An August nor'easter rolled left of its usual line and threw wind inland with the arrogance of a thing that doesn't believe in maps. Rain fell in vertical threads for a day and then changed its mind and slanted in at an angle that let it insist on every weakness. On Sunday night, lightning spoke bluntly. On Monday morning, forestry crews unfolded in the region like stitches. A logging road north of the old camp had been a problem for years. ruts when wet, dust when dry, neighbors with opinions either way. After the storm, a white pine older than the United States lay across it, roots torn from the duff with a sound that people who were there later described using words like bone. The tree's crown, thrown 30 feet from the stump, was a nest of branches the size of small trees, all sprung and tangled like a giant had been knitting and then lost interest. A trail maintainer named Harold, retired, wiry, a man made of habit and good sense, went out with a saw to help clear. He hadn't worked this section in years. He liked being where the land had new sentences. With 2 other volunteers, he limbed the trunk, working the way old men work who don't intend to prove anything. When he reached the crown, he climbed into it carefully to cut branches back into something the loader could lift. That was when he found the backpack. It wasn't on the ground. It was hung in the crown like a bird's extraordinary decision. The fabric had been blue once and was now the color of rainwater and memory. One strap was wrapped 3 times around a limb high enough that Harold had to stand on the loader's bucket to reach. The zippers were stuck, but not hopeless. Harold stood there with a hand on the pack, not sure whether to cut or call. He called. The deputy who came out knew the old story and carried it the way people carry a folded letter. He radioed the state. The state sent a warden and a detective whose posture said he knew the difference between sensational and solemn. They photographed the scene from more angles than seemed necessary and then carefully unwound the strap, as if the branch might object. On the ground, under a tarp, they opened the bag like a gift from someone who could not attend the party. Inside were things that belonged to boys who go to camp: a crushed granola bar wrapper, a whistle, a flashlight with 2 corroded AA batteries inside like the ghosts of power, a rolled t-shirt with Birchfield printed on it in a font that had gone out of style before it was ever really in. There was also a spiral notebook with a cardboard cover softened by time. They laid it flat as if it might spook. The first pages were ordinary: lists of birds, a quick sketch of a counselor holding a canoe paddle like a skeptical scepter, a sun drawn too big, because in Maine in July the sun is exactly that. The middle pages were something else. Maps. Dozens. Not of the world, or even of Maine. Of Birchfield's trails. Of the turn at the cedar snag. Of the lichen boulder with the constellation circles. Of a shortcut stroked in graphite, annotated with dots, blazes here, and small arrows pointing to things only Evan would have thought to include: a root shaped like a snake, a pair of birches grown from the same stump like a fork in an old road. The handwriting was tidy and small. The north arrow was always there, drawn like a compass rose in miniature because it pleased him. On 3 pages the lines grew tentative, broken, as if the pencil had hesitated inside the hand. On the last fully legible page, a note: if I cut east, I can meet the lake trail at the wall. Under it, smaller: don't hurry. Hurrying ruins maps. The wardens carried the backpack and notebook out as if they weighed more than the tree. They called the Mercers with the care of people who have rehearsed terrible sentences. Mark had died 3 winters before. He went in his sleep the way people say they want to and rarely do. Dana answered the phone in a house whose sounds had learned her, then sat down on the floor because it was nearer than a chair. She did not ask what, because the opening line told her enough. Ms. Mercer, this is Warden Kincaid. We've recovered something from Birchfield property we believe belonged to Evan. She said thank you because she was built that way. The reporters came, as they do. The warden refused to show them the notebook, and the more he refused, the more gentle they became. He read 1 page to one journalist who had practiced the art of not pushing. In return, the article that ran 2 days later read like a letter. He drew what he loved until it betrayed him. The reporter wrote and mailed a copy to the school where Evan's social studies teacher had retired. The community wrote in the comments section as if it were a quilt. I remember him in the cafeteria, quiet, sweet. My son still has his map of the canoe route. Maybe he learned to draw it from Evan. Bring him home, please. Searchers went back out because that is what respect looks like. 20 years had changed the forest's haircut. Hemlocks had fallen where a generation earlier they would have scoffed at the idea of gravity. Younger firs had taken their places with arrogant posture. Cathedral Grove was still cool. Dogs worked the ground like an old case file, more out of duty than hope. They found a place where the roots of the fallen white pine had torn up a mat of earth and revealed a hint of cloth that turned out to be nothing but an old tarp from somebody else's season. If the backpack had been in the crown for 2 decades, and the growth rings around the straps indent on the limb argued yes. How did it get there? Theories arranged themselves politely for inspection. The first was the most literal. Evan climbed for a look. 16-year-old boys climb trees. White pines make a staircase of branches if they're generous. A kid who loves maps might believe elevation is a remedy. Perhaps he slung the backpack around his shoulder as he climbed and hoisted it higher when it snagged, thinking he would retrieve it when he came back down, then fell. People looked at the ground at the base of trees differently after that, asking why no one had found a body then. And the warden talked about leaf litter and animals and the way the forest knows how to digest even what it doesn't ask for. The second theory was the most ordinary main story, bears. Food hangs are a religion in places with clever mammals. Birchfield taught the single pulley method. Toss a rope over a high limb, hoist the bag, tie off to a trunk. A kid could improvise the lesson, a kid could not. Maybe he heard something that made his scalp go cold and tossed the pack hard. The strap wound itself around the limb, and the bag stayed. If a storm followed and loosened the bark, the strap could have cinched. He might have run. He might have climbed. The quiet between maybe and might have is where most mysteries live. The third theory was the most meteorological, microbursts. The search manager from 2001 sent the new warden an email with an attachment from an old weather log. The afternoon Evan vanished a small cell, had parked above the ridge, and dropped cold air like a hammer, the sort of localized downburst that snaps tops and throws light things into the canopy. A backpack could be a light thing if it is between the ground and a sudden decision. The fourth, which the wardens did not indulge in public, was the one that keeps parents up, a stranger. But there was nothing in the record to dress that theory except fear. No evidence of it 20 years earlier, no footprints drawn in a different grammar, no rumor that stayed consistent long enough to be credible. The backpack argued for a solitude that had gone bad. The notebook argued for a boy doing his best to remain who he was. Dana met the warden at the station to see the notebook. She touched the cover the way you touch a window. She read the maps one by one, choking on the detail because the detail was so em. The last page, the one with the "don't hurry" line, made a noise in her throat she did not recognize as hers. He would have written that to himself, she said. He would have believed that slowing down makes things reveal their stations. The warden nodded because he had learned how to nod at sentences that are true in more than one tense. The county reopened the case because boxes must be checked if justice is to remain on its feet. They combed the old search logs and marked Cathedral Grove again with a red circle on a digitized map. They interviewed Amy again, who was now 42 and had stopped teaching because sometimes the heart gets tired of second periods and parent nights and would rather be a person than a professional. She told the story in fewer words because time had winnowed it. He stepped out of the frame, she said, and I didn't see where he went. She did not cry. She had cried in other rooms. A neighbor of the camp remembered something new, or thought she did. A snapping sound like a limb gone wrong on the afternoon of the search, followed by a hush even in the birds. The detectives wrote it down because omission, even innocent, can feel like betrayal when someone is dead. A former counselor, now a lawyer, argued that the camp had done all any reasonable entity could do, which was true and completely irrelevant to the hole punched through a single family's calendar. Where the white pine had fallen, Harold the maintainer came back on his own time after the crews had finished to cut around from the stump. He counted rings with the seriousness of a priest. He could not, of course, count up to the exact year a strap had cinched itself into a groove high in the crown. What is not that generous? But he could run his finger along the rings for 2001 and imagine the cambium tightening in a drought year and then easing. Imagine rope fibers pressed into bark and then becoming part of the tree's story as decidedly as a scar becomes part of a cheek. He carried the round to his garage and sanded it and set it on a shelf between a jar of bolts and a fishing lure and left it there because memorials do not always ask to be named. In October, when the leaves were better behaved and the air had that conspiracy of clarity and sting that most people call fall, the county held a small ceremony at the camp. They planted a young white pine just off the main trail, where campers could pass and be told or not told, depending on the year and the attention span of the guide. Dana came, wearing a scarf Evan had once used as a belt. The loop at one end still knotted the way 15-year-olds knot things. Ryan came, hands in his jacket pockets, and stood apart, staring at the map of the place posted on a board as if it might decide to correct itself in his presence. Amy spoke, and her words were simple. "We looked," she said, "and we keep looking." The warden said the name, and then was silent long enough to make the name the only thing the place could hear. No bones were found. This fact angered some people who need the earth to be tidy. It comforted others who didn't like to look at their grief too directly. The warden told Dana that in this country, if a person is to be found after 20 years, winter is the finder. Snow knocks branches off and reveals what is under. Frost heaves. Animals move things. "If we find him," he said, "you'll be the first." She believed him. She also surprised herself by realizing she didn't need the call to know the next day would arrive and have chores in it that required the ordinary tools of the kitchen. What happened to Evan? The unsatisfying, adult answer: the forest kept him. The boy's notebook had already expanded the world around the camp by making its edges legible. The backpack returning was like a hand pushed back through the membrane from the other side, holding paper instead of flesh. He had done what 16-year-olds do when they believe that attention to detail is a cure-all. He had told himself not to hurry. He had climbed, perhaps, the way boys climb, because elevation is a promise of sense. He'd stowed his food or tossed the bag or had it lifted by a wind that didn't care about his project. He'd stumbled or fallen or taken shelter or simply moved until the map in his mind drew back like a tide. He'd stopped somewhere that didn't want to be a somewhere anymore. The camp now keeps copies of Evan's maps, laminated, in a small drawer in the office. New counselors pull them out on the first day of training and run their fingers over his neat north arrows and talk about situational awareness and the kindness of redundancy. They tell the kids not to leave the trail even if they can see the lake between the trees, which is a sermon with too obvious a moral to be persuasive. Still, some sermons stick for reasons unrelated to the skill of the preacher. At the end of each session, the director, new, sharp, careful, tells families that the woods are both generous and literal. He says there is no better place to get lost and found. And then he lets the sentence hang, as if its old shadow still stood behind it, taller, thinner, reminding everyone that words last longer than we mean them to. In the winter that followed the backpack's recovery, Cathedral Grove swallowed snow like a secret. Hemlock boughs bent and held, an act of faith so quiet even wind forgot to narrate it. On a day in February, a fox crossed the main trail and left a script that read clearly until the next storm erased it, as if to remind anyone reading that not all texts ask to be preserved. Far above, a limb where a strap had once cut into bark shook in a gust, and then was still. The new white pine, planted in October, brought its needles together against the cold the way small things do. And there is Evan, still. He is on a page in a spiral notebook, not as a ghost, but as a geographer. He is at the lichen boulder, drawing the mint circles with a concentration that makes adults call other adults over to make them see. He is writing the reminder that both breaks your heart and keeps it beating. Don't hurry. Hurrying ruins maps. He is the sound in the woods that you think is a counselor calling your name. He is the quiet at the back of a line of boys on a summer trail, a kid with his head tilted to hear something that might not have been said yet. He is the backpack in the crown of a fallen tree, held there for 2 decades by a strap and a story and a forest that understood, better than we did, that some returns take as long as they need to.